Okay.
Good morning, everybody. My name is John Winchell. This is the second installment of our Fireside chat. The last one was on manure screening and fecal starch. It was really interesting. And then this one, obviously, with Buzz and Chris is going to be a very pertinent one as well. We know with what has been going on in the industry with the reduction of milk, there's been a lot of farms that have been making decisions whether they were rash or not. And I felt that it was pretty important to kind of see some of the options that are being done and some of the tactics that some people can do in the industry to kind of help out their customers and make some changes. And Buzz, you and Rachel Brong had put together a nice little checklist that I saw here a couple weeks ago, and I thought it was very nice and comprehensive and worthy of sharing. So I appreciate that. And I will let you introduce yourselves as well, and you can start here in a second. Right after you introduce yourself, if you can, I will run a poll real quick, and then you can fire away. And for questions, if you guys can wait till the end of the call for questions. The webinar says 2 hours, but it's only going to be an hour, probably 50 minutes, I would say. And then you can ask questions in the chat box when you're done, because when you unmute everybody, it seems like you run into a cell phone conversation or other things like that. But Buzz, go ahead and roll on.
Hey, I'm Buzz Burhans. I've been an independent nutritionist most of my career. I spent 5 years as technical service director for a feed company, but other than that, for over 35 years, pretty much been an independent nutritionist. I do direct work for dairies, and in recent years, I do an increasing amount of training to either consulting groups or some feed companies around the world, and do some tech support for consultants, occasionally feed companies. Tech support is mostly to consulting groups. So I'm honored to be invited by John to be here today.
Thank you, John. This is Chris Rossiter Burhans, and as of this year, this will be my 40th year as a veterinarian with a primarily dairy focus. I did do a master's early in my career in epidemiology, so my interest has always been at the herd level of both disease and management at the herd level for dairies. I was at Cornell for 15 years and co-developed the Nice Chat program there based around Johne's disease originally. For the last 19 years, I've been tech support at Pool and Grain, an independent nutrition and feed company in Vermont and New York. But most of all, I'm the other percent of dairy tech, and Buzz and I are fortunate to be able to share our passion for dairy together, and we collaborate 24/7, and it's really been great. So glad to be here with him.
All right. Well, I will throw up a poll here real quick just to see what people's thoughts are, and here it is.
So John, I need to stop my video, is that right?
Nope, you're okay. You just you're okay. It'll should show up.
Okay.
And the question is, what tactics are your customers implementing in lieu of the reduced milk? And we'll let this run a few seconds here. Do you see it, Buzz?
Yep.
Good. And then Buzz, you and Chris can give your thoughts on the answers and what your thoughts are on it. So far, it looks pretty typical of what you would expect to see. We're about I'll end the poll.
Okay, I no longer see it.
Okay. Let me end it here. Okay, can you see that now? Here, sharing the results.
There you go.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's quite interesting. It's quite similar to what I check, what I'm seeing as well. Emphasis on nutritional tactics, management tactics, not as much grouping changes as we might expect, or I think might be advantageous at this point.
Are you surprised to see that the grouping is that low? I'm seeing a lot more options with grouping. Are you?
Yeah, I think there's more options out there than people are implementing yet. But we're also very early in this, so
yeah.
it may be that there's more use of that. Of course, that is limited in some cases by facilities as well.
More constraints for that you have to work around.
Understand. All right, you guys are free to go. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, John, I really am honored to be asked to do this today. I will tell you that if we do half as good a job as you did with the degree day presentation you made the other day, we'll consider it a roaring success. That was great. We're going to talk about reducing feed costs when milk is being shipped, and I am suddenly unable to move my slides. So what's going on? There we go. So this is what prompted this. The current situation is obviously one that's generating interest in some options to deal with that. And those options are complicated because, in my opinion, the biggest thing is uncertainty about what's going on and how long it will go on. Not only is the milk market itself changed, but then milk prices are changing. How long is this going to go on, and what's going to happen to the overall economy make it really difficult, I think, to come up with ideas that are going to work or that you want to implement anyway. We found, Rachel and I did that first one, that list, because it appeared that there are a lot of limited or incomplete ideas out there. And so we wanted to sort of gather them all up and throw them out there. I'm not an expert in this. We just tried to, in our conversations, come up with a more comprehensive list for people to consider, because in many cases they didn't seem to be considering all the potential options. But the options raise all kinds of related questions, like how do you do these things? And what another question that came up is, how do I reverse course? If I want to go backwards, if this thing is over in 6 weeks, I don't mean COVID will be, but maybe the need to cut milk as drastically as it is, then how will I be able to reverse course and go back to my normal production levels? And there were questions around biosecurity, particularly for people that are feeding milk that were not feeding milk before. So it raises the question of what's the best option, and we think that varies by farm, and it varies by the assumptions that people make about some of the things above, about how quick they want to turn around, how long they think it's going to last, what their own situation is. So for what we're going to talk about, the options here are based on the presumption of a desire to restore previous herd production in a relatively short period of time. There are other options that we could put up that would involve a longer recovery period if that's what people decided to do. But in many cases, I think people are hoping, certainly we are, that this will not last an extremely long time, and we want to be able to turn it around again fairly quickly. So that puts some constraints on the options. In my opinion, there's 5 things that we need to consider, and we'll talk about these 5 things in the next hour. There are 3 things that are related to feed costs. We need to figure out how to reduce the total amount of concentrates fed to the herd, how much grain we're buying, not necessarily to every cow in the herd, but we need to cut back if we can. Second thing is, can we do anything about the cost of that concentrate? Can we lower the prices at all of the concentrate itself? And the third thing, which is similar to concentrate costs but involves other things as well, is how can we reduce the ration costs sort of independently of the concentrate costs? I think that we also need to realize that we need to be looking ahead at this coming feeding year, 2020, 2021. We are getting into where we're going to be harvesting our forages, and I have been promoting high quality forages for as long as I've been doing this, so over 35 years. And I'd like to just make a couple of comments on that, and I want to make a couple of cautions about things that I think could be detrimental. So let's jump in. The first question I got was a call from one of the guys that I work with, who called actually several weeks ago now and said he had been asked to dump milk. And he had already started feeding milk to his calves. He was feeding milk replacer. But some of the other options for that and questions that have come up since then are, can we feed some bob calves? Can we feed cows milk? And I added the replacement heifers. If we can feed it to mature cows, we can feed it to growing heifers post-weaning. And we've had guys that have fed not milk in the past, but whey to pigs, and you could certainly feed milk to pigs as well. So a little bit of a side enterprise there. What can we do to take advantage of this milk supply? We can feed our calves for an extended period of time, at least another month. So instead of drying them off somewhere around 50 or 60 days, we could probably go out another month. I think they would do well. For those of you who have experience with whatever you want to call it, an intensified or accelerated milk program, one of the issues with those programs is that it's not uncommon for those calves to look like $1 million and then to go backwards at weaning. And I think we have to think about how we're going to wean these calves that have had higher levels of milk, if that's what we're going to do. And largely that involves extending the weaning time. You can't take an animal that's been getting 10 or 12 quarts of milk, or even 8 quarts of milk, and wean her in 5 days and think that she's going to come on dry feed as well as she would if you took more time to do that. I also there have been a couple of questions that came up about people feeding milk by just ad-libbing it. And I think it should be formulated into the rations. Mike Hutchins has said a couple of times, he's calculated the value of milk, and not only is milk expensive when we consider it as a cost of obtaining that milk, but it's also very valuable, has a high value when you look at the nutrients it brings, and it makes sense to formulate the ration with that so that you can then reduce some concentrate cost at the same time. I would guess that in many cases, we should keep the TMRs above 40% dry matter. Some of that comes from, I believe, some work that was done by Larry Chase, maybe even by Bill Minzy a long time ago at Cornell. And I think that there is some confounding in terms of the moisture content that will work with whether or not these are ensiled feeds. If you have really wet haylage, for instance, you are very likely to end up with some funky fermentations, as you guys all know, and those fermentations can contain some anti-nutritional factors and some anti-palatability factors. So I'm not sure that 40% is an absolute number when we're not considering highly fermented feeds. And when we feed milk, another question that has come up a lot is, how safe is it to feed milk? What are the disease risks? How much risk am I incurring there? So to answer that question, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chris.
Thank you, Buzz. So here I've put together what is a very short list to make some major points. And this is about short-term disease risk. I think we're all aware there is always risk involved with everything. So in my mind, what it is that we're asking is, what is the relative risk if we are going to feed back raw milk, A, to mature cows, or B, to young stock? A lot of people have fed unpasteurized milk to young stock in the past and are aware of how to manage that. But this feeding it back to mature cows is a whole new arena for all of us. So I'd like to at least put it in the perspective of what's the relative risk of feeding it back. The first point is that the disease overall, the disease risk is quite low, but it's not zero, and that's particularly with reference to mature cows. It is very, very low. But the disease risk is much greater for calves because they are much more susceptible and they do not have a very well-developed immune system such as mature cows do. And they also don't have a rumen, which is quite protective. So I think the right way to think about it is the disease risk that we're going to see in our herd is really proportional, directly proportional to the level of pathogens that we have in our cows and our environment. What does happen is that the pathogens we have in our herd cycle through the cows and through the rumen and out through the GI tract and into the manure, and then they cycle around again because we all know cows live in a manure-laden environment and they drink out of water troughs that are not pristine. So this is going on all the time, and what we're doing to it now is adding milk, which relative to these other things is quite low risk. So let's think about a few of the specifics that are diseases that we are mostly all concerned about with regards to cattle. And my list would be, Johne's disease is at the top of this list in terms of its transmissibility. It's very transmissible to young animals, not to mature cows. But next we have Mycoplasma, we have Staph aureus, Salmonella, BVD, all of those things that we know can cycle through the herd. I have communicated with a few of my epidemiology researchers about this, so this isn't just my opinion, but research has been done adequately, but there's still a lot to be known, that most of these organisms in general will cycle through the GI tract and come out in the manure. It's not very common that these organisms will leak through the GI tract and into, let's say, the systemic or bloodstream and then seed somewhere else. Now that does happen with Johne's disease, and it can happen with these others probably under severe stress events, but it's not that common. So there are some ways in this new era that we can think about, if we haven't been doing this before, how to minimize the risk that is probably already low in milk, but minimize it further. And one of the things is, if we're going to feed raw milk, is to take it from our high producing cow group. That's diluted milk. It's going to be the lowest risk. It's past the stress of the transition period. So that's going to be our lowest risk milk. It's also going to conserve components probably in the milk that's remaining. And then second, which is obvious, is this is a fresh product, whether it's going to cows or calves. We really need to have it be a policy to put really good sanitation and clean milk handling practices in place. If we haven't been doing that before, we really need to pay attention to that, how it's being stored and fed out. If you haven't looked into what your pathogen level is in the herd for some of these important things that you think might be impacting your farm, it's a really good time to hook up with your veterinarian and maybe identify, are there a few of these pathogens that you should assess what your level is if this is going to turn out to be a long-term system. So in general, remember that the environmental risk for exposure to these things is way higher than the risk that we're going to get in milk in general. So it really is dependent upon, what your level of exposure is in your environment. And long-term, at least with regards to calves, we really need to consider pasteurization for feeding milk to calves, but that's a significant investment of both financial in equipment and management and time.
So with that, I'm going to ask Chris to come back in a couple slides, I think maybe even the next slide, to talk about feeding calves. But before we get there, I want to finish my list of things that are related to reducing the amount of concentrate that we're buying and feeding. Obviously, many of these relate to animal management practice as opposed to the diets themselves. We can reduce herd size by doing some culling. That can have some implications for the potential to recover from this. If you cull, so we've got guys that are being mandated to reduce milk by 15%. If they go out and cull to get to that level today, and then in a month or 6 weeks, it turns out that they can go back to the full 100%, then culling could present some problems if it's too aggressive. It's been suggested in a session I was on yesterday to cull for components rather than some of the other things. Obviously, we want to cull for health issues first, but it may be that it makes sense to cull some cows that have very low component yields because your pay price is still going to be impacted by your component yield, not just the fluid yield. And there has been, interestingly, a couple of situations in the last week where I am aware of people that are buying cows for dairy reasons. A robot dairy that's starting up, some people that have to, that need more milk in their particular situation. So it's possible that there is some potential for cow sales, and that's not widespread, but it's not something that should be dismissed, that nobody's buying cows. The idea of milking 3x to 2x has come up a number of times. My suggestion, and I agree with Mike Hutchins, if you've heard him talk about this, is this probably should not be a consideration for early lactation cows. We want those cows to be at least past peak and maybe mid-lactation or late lactation. Yesterday, an interesting idea came up. One guy was milking his tail end cows 1x, which is quite interesting because they're obviously not going to come back around, but he didn't want to dry them off yet. So it's an interesting idea. We can dry cows off early. It's somewhat related to that 1x on the tail enders. I have a caution there. One of the biggest things that has come up in the last, I guess, in the last 20, 30 years, from around 1990, when we first started talking about transition cows, is the idea that overfeeding energy to far dry cows has an impact on the amount of abdominal fat. And when you have that, abdominal fat is also the most labile fat in the body. So when you go into negative energy balance post-calving, that's the fat that will be mobilized most quickly, better than back fat or other body stores. And the plumbing is such that that fat all goes directly to the liver. So I have been telling people that one of the most important things we can do is not to overfeed energy to our far dry cows. People call me and say, I got a problem with my transition cows. And the first question I have is, what's your far dry diet look like? We can implement or expand our low groups as a way to cut back on the grain we're feeding. So some guys with very high producing herds have abandoned the concept of a low group. And that may be something, because when you're really high producing, those cows, even on high energy, high density diets, are continuing to milk well right to the end of lactation. It's possible to, though we might intentionally put them into a low group, or we might expand the low group. If I've got 4 groups, then maybe I make 2 low groups instead of just having one that's a low group. We can take the low diets. I've always been really cautious about those diets because not only do the cows take a hit when they move groups or when they change pens, but they take a hit when that diet density changes. But we can be a little bit less concerned about that now, and maybe even be more conservative in the amount we feed to low group rations. And some people could implement what I have had guys do in the past, which is a stripper group. Stripper meaning cows that are basically not milking much. They're just being stripped out essentially at the very end of lactation, and they're getting fat. That may be another option. Those are my list for how to cut back the amount of grain we feed. But part of that is to feed it to calves, and I would like to turn it back to Chris to talk a little bit about calf feeding.
Great. So this is what I think is a good checklist. Whether you're used to feeding unpasteurized milk back to calves, or for a lot of people who are going to be changing from the convenience of milk replacer to feeding whole milk, there's really a lot more that you have to consider and manage. So this is a good checklist that if you're going to be doing this, you should go through each one of these points and think about how you're going to address it and manage it in whatever system you set up. It's pretty general, but I think that the principles apply pretty strongly. So the first principle above all is if it's raw milk, you need to keep it clean. You need to do that if you're pasteurizing as well, but it needs to be clean no matter where you are with it and what stage of the process. This is superb nutrition, and it's fresh, and it needs to be managed to keep clean so that it doesn't actually develop into growing other bacteria and degrading properties. So this means basically you have to now collect it from clean cows into clean containers, and I strongly recommend to not feed raw waste milk back to calves. That, even though milk is relatively low risk, that would not be the case for waste milk, both from a bacteria and an antibiotic perspective. So you have a couple of options to feed raw milk. The first one, and for people who have not done this before, probably the most important concept is to keep it simple. And not just me, but others feel that you are the safest to take it warm from the cow and get it to the calf in 30 minutes. That's the simplest system. And you can usually do that some way within your existing system without a lot of extra equipment. But you may want to look at the inconvenience probably of coordinating your feeding times with your milking times, so you can harvest warm milk straight from the line and get it to the calves in a timely manner, and it'll still be a reasonable temperature. The other option is to take good clean milk after the plate cooler, because you can't coordinate with feeding times. But now you have some other steps, and you have to collect that in some sort of clean storage container or containers. It has to sit, and then you have to reheat it to some degree to feed. So there's several handling steps here that allow both the milk to be recontaminated, and you have to reheat it. That system requires a lot of thinking, and there's no recipe. It's a very farm-specific system to figure out. For those that might want to be doing this long-term, this gives you the chance to try to figure out how you might make a long-term system work. But option number one is certainly going to work the easiest to begin. So some of the other specifics is, what temperature can you get away with feeding? Well, the ideal is 102 degrees. But I think, such as with option 2 or even option 1, at least our first 14-day-old animals, we should try to get the temperature close to 90 to 102, and you could do that mixing your milk with a small percentage of hot milk replacer to bring that temperature up. You could warm it in sinks of hot water or steam vats if you have one. The older animals are more resilient, and they probably can handle milk somewhere around 80 degrees. If needed, you should just monitor them to make sure they don't have discomfort or colic. Obviously, in the long run, pasteurization is the best option. At the end, I'll show you a few examples of, if you have someone that's really creative about feeding calves on the farm, there's a lot of options for looking at group feeding, certainly in the short term. That might be a real advantage for getting rid of some of this milk. The amounts, Buzz has already mentioned, and I think we all agree, 20% of the body weight, so basically 2 to 3 gallons per day to a typical Holstein calf would be fairly typical. Jerseys have pretty high energy requirement, and they can handle quite a bit as well. But the point is that we do need to pay attention to the transition and make sure we give them enough time to get onto solid feed. Consistency for calves is really important. So once you figure out how you're going to do this, it's really important to try to keep it somewhat consistent. Keep it clean, keep the temperature management somewhat consistent, as well as paying attention to the volumes that you're actually feeding. We should be monitoring this raw milk. So a standard plate count, you probably can get done through the co-op. Weekly to start would be a good idea to find out what your level of contamination is. And you could look at the components initially, but I don't think if you do all of these things that the component issue will be a practical one. And last, there will be some probably folks who might want to consider adding a coccidiostat, which is probably a good choice, or maybe the Clarify larvicide, also probably a good choice. These things are available in ad packs. They certainly do come at a cost, but probably can be pretty cost effective. And there's lots of information about those. If you need questions, people can help sort that out. And then the last I've had a lot of experience with group housing, and it certainly has its pros and cons. But if our management is pretty good in group housing and we have decent ventilation, we can do a lot with these calves. On the left side is just a couple of pictures of feeding, milk to animals in individual pens, which is pretty straightforward. But on the right, we have a whole lot of options for how we might feed calves in groups, at least temporarily, especially with good weather. There's an example here of an outside summer setup where there's a large calf hutch in the background, and they're fed in acidified milk in garbage cans, and it works really well in the summer. So you have some options if you have someone that's creative and wants to try these. These things are usually pretty successful. If it's raw milk, you really need to be looking at feeding 2 to 3 times a day, given the volumes, but with acidified milk, it can be ad lib. And so I hope that offers some guidelines as this is just the beginning of this, but as you get started, good checklist to follow.
Thanks, Chris. So let's move on to, we were talking about reducing the amount of concentrate. Let's talk a little bit about how to get the cost of that concentrate that we do feed down. I think that the nutritionists and the dairymen should be having conversations and should be taking a look, the nutritionists anyway, should be taking a look at what ingredients are in that. We tend to, I think, often get locked into our favorite ingredients sometimes and not consider everything. So I've given a couple examples. Palm has become very common and widespread, but it's significantly more expensive than calcium salts, for instance. If you're looking for a rumen inert fat, should we be feeding? We have options for soybean. Should we feed canola or soybean meal, or should we feed a bypass protein product or blood meal? If barley's a good buy, we probably, in the East anyway, we can't feed all barley because our diets are corn silage based, so you'd end up with some problems with fermentability of the diet. In the West, you can feed a lot more barley than we are used to feeding in the East. And beet pulp versus citrus pulp versus gluten feed. So examples of things that we can look at. We should be revisiting what we're doing. We also should obviously consider what additives we're adding into the concentrates. And I would suggest that we need to differentiate additives that are in there for health reasons versus production reasons. So for instance, an example of an additive that actually has both health and production responses, but is very important for health, is biotin, which has a positive benefit for foot health. And then we have other additives that are predominantly just for production. Most of the additives that we're adding for health reasons, we probably should continue to add for health reasons. We want to keep our herds healthy. Again, assuming that we're going to turn them around and we're not going to cull them all. One of the things that I think I see a lot of that there's opportunities is, this is a business that in the time I've been doing it, we nutritionists are asked to walk closer and closer to the edge of the cliff in terms of how hot and how healthy and how safe these diets are. So I see a fair number of diets that have a fair amount of SARA risk in them, and people are covering that SARA risk by adding binders in there. I think if we were more concerned about SARA risk, we could get rid of binders in a lot of the diets that I see out here. Sometimes I've had guys tell me, I'm afraid to take the binder out because I get bloody gut when I don't have the binder in there. And my opinion would be that those diets are too hot. You should not necessarily think you're going to have bloody gut if you don't have a binder in your diet, as an example of healthy diets. Then we need to look at production additives from the perspective of their return on investment. That's not something that's done very widely. We get a lot of meta-analysis about additives these days. We need to think not just about whether they work, because there are additives that work that don't necessarily have a great return on investment when you look at their cost and the amount of return they have. One of the things that I've been doing, and it's beyond what we can do here, is I think that we should, as an industry, we should do a lot more looking at the probability of response. So I have an additive, and the additive has meta-analyses that show that to get this response, what is not in the meta-analyses, at least that's very easy to pick out, is what is the distribution of responses to this. So you get a kilo response to this product, but what is the range of responses that were in the trials where this product was tested and then put into this meta-analysis? So in some cases, when that range is very wide, it's going to decrease the probability that you'll get the response that you think you're getting. A meta-analysis reports essentially the average response, which means that about half of the time you'll get a bigger response than that, but half of the time these studies had a smaller response. When we take the product to the field, that same distribution is likely to be true, that half of the time we're going to get less than that. So what I want to know is what is the probability that I'll make money with this thing and make enough to be worth spending it in there. Mike Hutchins has been adamant about concern about transition and early lactation diets. Those are not diets that I think we want to mess around with very much. Again, my assumption is we want to be able to turn this thing around and go back to normal production levels. You can't go back to normal production levels if we've hamstrung our early lactation and transition cows. I think that many producers and many nutritionists don't communicate well enough. You know, we have guys that we've worked with forever, and I've got guys that say, I don't want to have this conversation. I'm just going to leave it up to you. I don't want all that responsibility, to tell you the truth. I think that we could do better to talk more, to have conversations about what we're doing. I think that benefits both sides. And for producers, I really feel that producers should make an effort to work with the nutritionists and the suppliers. It's not enough that the guy shows up and walks your cows and gives you diets. I think that you need to have a working relationship, and that's also true with your suppliers. I get a little bit disappointed, I guess is the word, when I see stuff, and I'm in a couple of dairy groups on Facebook, and you get people that are posting all the time that, you know, the feed guy can't be trusted. They're out to, or the feed company can't be trusted. My opinion would be, if you're a person who thinks that you can't trust anybody, that says more about you than it does about the people that you're working with. Most of the feed guys I know came off of dairy farms. They were dairy kids at one point. They didn't just suddenly change or become untrustworthy because they went in the feed business. And most of the feed suppliers I know are reputable and honest. That doesn't mean you should never change. Sometimes a change is merited, but I do think that when somebody is jumping around all the time, that they end up not having as good a performance as they would if they had somebody that they trusted and was competent. And their competence levels are different, but they'll end up with better rations. One of the things I think we should consider doing, and this requires a conversation between the producer and the nutritionist, what could we do if we use multiple rations? There's a lot of herds, very high producing herds, that are just feeding a single protein mix or a single ration to most of the cows. And I'm not thinking so much of transition diets here, but once they get into established lactation, maybe we should have more than one mix out there, and that would be a saving as well. The idea of robot pellets, I would just mention that there's a great article by Ruzick and Hoffman in the October 25th issue of Hordes. They did a survey of herds in the upper Midwest feeding robot pellets, and their conclusions were that the simpler, less expensive robot pellets were actually associated with higher levels of performance in robot herds. I know that I work with some people that some nutritionists that are formulating robot pellets. They're not using a line mix. And I think that's the strategy that they're working, and I know they're working, it's working quite well. And I also think that Greg Penner in Saskatchewan has done some work, and his work suggests similarly that that the PMR is probably more important than the robot pellet. I'm not saying you can't, the robot pellet is contributing, but we got to get the PMR right. I think I had a guy, a friend of ours one time that came over and was distressed because he had, his banker told him he had the highest feed cost of anybody. He's a good dairyman. Had the highest feed cost of anybody in his, in their region. He was sitting on a chair in the living room. I said, well, and he had a pretty good feed guy, a guy that's real good people skills and, reasonably good nutritionist. So I said, why don't you take your mix and get a quote on that exact same mix from the other suppliers that are in your area. And then, so you want to have a quote on the same mix so you can compare whether you're reasonable. If you're reasonable, and even if somebody is, $1 a ton or $5 a ton less, and it's working for you, then you stay there. You don't have to change to chase the last penny in every mix. But if it's not, then maybe you should look at something else. And I think it's a good idea to get competitive quotes if you're a dairyman from other suppliers. I am not saying that you should always take the lowest quote. As I said at the top of this list, you need to be working with your nutritionists and your suppliers, but you just want to make sure that everything is reasonable. In my own work, my stuff goes out for quotes, and we are quoting more frequently than we used to. I think, we would used to get quotes a couple times a year. We're doing that more often. You don't have to do it every single load of feed, obviously, but it is worth doing more frequently. The last point of those three was to reduce ration cost. So let's look at some things to reduce ration costs independent of the concentrate cost. We can obviously reallocate forages in some instances. One of the big ones that I see out there is people that are using BMR, and they're feeding BMR or low lignin alfalfa, and the way that they have it stored, they're basically feeding it to everybody. The best use of that stuff is on the front end of the lactation. So it's something to keep in mind as you harvest this year. And it's also something to think about if you can separate it. And even in some bunkers, I've got guys that it's layered in the bunk, not multiple layers, but the top or the bottom half is mostly BMR and the other side is conventional corn, for instance. You can make some distinction between the high group and the low group, or even if it's the same groups, your fresher group and your other groups. So we can reallocate forage quality, and that will have an impact on both productivity and on production costs. We tend not to update heifer rations as often as we do lactating rations. It's obviously not as big an economic investment in terms of the diet, but we could look at those rations more often in many cases. I'm a big fan of using an optimizer. There's two kinds of optimizers out there. There's one that's called a linear optimizer. That's the one, it's the least cost optimizing that many of us started with years and years ago. And then there is nonlinear optimizers. If you use a model for formulating diets that's based on something like CNCPS, and in CNCPS, feeds don't have necessarily fixed values for bypass protein, for instance. The amount of microbial yield, the requirement you have for bypass protein will change as well, depending on how much fermentable carbohydrate you have in there. You need a nonlinear optimizer to do that. The linear optimizers are for systems that are based on table values or library values. But either way, there's some opportunity there, especially for those of us who are using CNCPS. Using a nonlinear optimizer takes more time. It's harder to optimize. It's well worth it. I don't think, though, you have to do it for every single ration change. I think that doing it periodically can bring up some surprises. I had a consultant that I work with who asked about optimizing, and we looked at that, and I was able to get 40 cents out of a diet. Now, that's a significant amount of money by running the optimizer. I think we need to spend some time evaluating alternative ingredients. So we have things like the sesame program, and there are a couple derivatives out there that Normand St. Pierre came up with. Those tell us something about the market value of these ingredients, but the market value is not necessarily the same as the farm value, because it's going to depend on what other ingredients are in their diet and what their diet looks like. So the optimizer is a good way to tell whether an alternative ingredient is a better fit for this farm than just the market value. I think we want to realize that when we optimize, we don't always have to be looking at other ingredients. So we can optimize and allow our ingredients, contingent on the inventory, obviously, to move around, and sometimes there's some money to be saved there. Optimizing takes time, and in many cases, for the producers out there, I will tell you that your nutritionist can make you more money by staying in their office, looking at your records harder, and revising and updating and optimizing your rations. And that it's something I believe, but that was told to me recently by one of the best nutritionists, I think, in the country. I think that's true, and I think, you know, we all get used to it and we like it. There's not much that I enjoy more than walking a pen of cows, especially when I was working in Idaho, walking the dry lot dairies in those pens. The sun's out, it's great, but you know, that's an important part of what we need to do. But we should spend more time working on updating the diets and capturing, as things change, capturing any economic opportunities that are there. If you're going to have your nutritionist spend more time in their office looking at your diets, you need to have an effective and efficient information flow. That's also true in this COVID period, where most nutritionists are cutting back on the farm visits sort of independently of what they're doing with that time. There are things that can be done to improve the flow of information. You know, regular not necessarily a video conference, although those are being used, but you can also do it just with a phone conference as well. And this is one that I've done, and I've been feeding cows longer than probably most of you that are listening to this. And I still like to have somebody that I trust, another nutritionist, take a look at my diets periodically, because we need our own second opinion. You know, I'm not always as bright as I think I am, and there can be things that I'm just overlooking. Huge at the top of this list to reduce ration costs is don't overfeed protein. We have very high producing herds in this country now that are feeding 14 or 15% crude protein diets and are making 30,000 plus or minus pounds of milk. You can't always do that. You can't always get it that low. It's going to be contingent on forages and what else you're feeding in the diet and a number of different things. And I've used the Cornell model since it first came out. We think I was probably the first field guy to use it. There are other systems probably that can do that, but the ones that I am most aware of are using CNCPS. And I know that using that model, you can get these crude protein levels very low. Interestingly, CNCPS originated in research that was sponsored by New York City. A lot of the early work in the model was paid for by New York City because of concerns about nitrogen and phosphorus in their watershed. So you look at the southern tier of New York, Delaware Valley and down there, the whole objective of that thing was to try to be more precise about formulating and feed less, so we got less in the environment, but feeding less also gives us an economic advantage. So there's probably other systems out there that can do that, but for those of us that are familiar with CNCPS, I think there's opportunity there to feed a little bit less protein in many cases for many people that are using CNCPS, because I do a fair amount of support for people that are using some platform with the model. There are a couple platforms out there, but that's something maybe you should look into and investigate how you can get those diets down a little bit. One concern about CNCPS is I run into people that are using CPM dairy. CPM dairy was last updated about 15 years ago, and CNCPS, I believe, was version 5 at that time. I'm not sure, but pretty sure it was 5, and we're up to version 6.55. CPM is outdated. It's no longer supported by University of Pennsylvania, and the modern science, the work that Mike Van Amberg and the crew have done in the last 10 years in refining the model have made it much more precise. It's still a model, right? Models are not reality, so they're not necessarily easy or exactly right every time. But I encourage you to use the current CNCPS models. And if you're a producer, go ahead and ask your guy. A lot of guys don't have a clue what model I'm using unless I bring it up. But you guys could ask your nutritionist what they're using. I want to talk just a minute about the future this year. We are focused so much on dealing with this low milk price and reduction in the amount we're allowed to ship in many cases that I am afraid that we're not going to look at this year's forage crop as hard as we should. There are two things that have come up on my radar in recent times. And John Winchell did a fantastic job on a webinar the other day about growing degree days and using that to target forage harvest, especially for hay crop. It's also useful, as John will tell you, for corn, but corn is harvested partly on the grain content, and I think the big impact that looking at growing degree days has is on the digestibility of the fiber fractions in forage. And it was just a fantastic webinar, and I think John can point you in the direction of where the link to that is. It's probably still out there. I think it is. That was very, very useful. For those of you that are nutritionists, this is something that you could use instead of an extra walkthrough every month. Instead of walking through once a week, you could turn one of those walkthroughs into spending the equivalent amount of time each week or over a week, because it would take less time than it's going to take you to walk through once, and monitor the growing degree days. John can advise you or give you some ideas on how to do that. I was wicked impressed with what he is doing and the results. And the other thing that has been on my radar is the concept of a cocktail mix of forages instead of, we're all used to, I think, thinking mostly about alfalfa and corn silage. Daniel Olson has some very good ideas about cocktail mix. Some of that, I think, grew out of problems with the weather last year and having enough inventory this year. But I think that there are some other very good ways to utilize this concept of a cocktail mix. And Daniel Olson has a fair amount of materials and video materials out there that describe his thinking of how to use that. And I think those are two things that are high on my radar. I've been talking about forage quality since almost the beginning of my career, and it's certainly a lot better today than it was 35 years ago. But it's not what it could be. There's some guys that are hitting it all the time. They know how to get it done, and there's a lot of us that aren't getting it done quite as well as it could. And it will save you money if you can get high quality forages there. Finally, I just want to finish up by saying some things that I would caution you about. It has come up in a number of discussions that maybe I should just cut the grain that I'm feeding to the whole herd. Based on the assumption that this presentation is made on, that we want to preserve the opportunity to turn the herd around if that comes up fairly soon, that's probably not a good idea, because if you cut the grain carte blanche across the whole herd, including the transition and the early lactation cows, you're going to cut peaks, and you're going to have to wait till the herd freshens in again to get those cows back to where they were milking before we had to do this. There is a case around where there's a guy that I've heard is recommending some just arbitrary cuts to mineral supplementation. I disagree with that. Minerals, I'm not going to get into why they're important, and including the trace minerals are important. Trace minerals have a huge role in enzyme systems that make the biology inside our cows work, and it's not a good idea to leave those out. Sure, you can leave them out short term and you won't see much of a difference, short term being very short, but they will have an impact. We're not, and I'm not suggesting that you need to overfeed them. So if they are being overfed, we can take some of that safety margin out of it, but it's not a good idea. Apparently, some people are recommending, well, we'll just stop feeding minerals or we'll cut them just arbitrarily. Bad idea, in my opinion. I also think that we talked about before the transition cows. I think that the additives that are in your transition diets, as long as you put them there and they are merited. Now, I do see diets. I do a fair amount of tech support for people, and I occasionally see diets that just have an incredible amount of additives in there, making them very expensive. I don't think in my NRC manual, there's no page that says, put the kitchen sink in your transition cow diets. So I think we could look at those. But in general, we need to keep them being fed very well. I've talked a little bit about the idea of jumping indiscriminately around suppliers for marginally cheaper feed. The guys that I think the guys that I admire most in this business are guys that basically have a good working relationship with their suppliers. And they do. I have guys that I love the guys, and they are not always buying from the same supplier. But the idea that, 5 cents on a ton of feed makes a difference, so I'm going to go somewhere else today. I think the suppliers bring a lot to the dairies, and if you don't have a supplier that you think does that, then look around. But I don't think that jumping around all the time is a good thing. I think Chris has given us some good ideas on feeding saleable milk. It's critical that you practice best management practices for hygiene and sanitation. I had a call, not just hygiene and sanitation. You have to think about cooling and heating for the calves. You got to think about agitation. One of the calls I got was from somebody that was putting saleable milk in a tank that did not have an agitator in it. And I got the call the day that he ended up feeding basically milk fat to his calves. And so we had to work that out. And finally, I am concerned about people doing business as usual for harvesting high digestibility forages. I think, as I said, listening to John Winchell's talk on growing degree days, which is, I think, available as a video, is very useful. It'll be useful for you that are producers that are listening to this, and it is a service that you can provide if you're a nutritionist providing services to dairies. I think it's a fantastic idea, and I think that getting familiar with Daniel Olson's ideas about these cocktail mixes, and sometimes it doesn't even have to be a mix. He's looking at some alternative feeds and harvesting strategies. I think that's useful too. So with that, that's all Chris and I have for you today. We'll be happy to answer any questions. My email is there, so if you have questions, or we're happy to answer them after this session is over. If something you come up with a consideration later on about calves or whatever. So with that, John, we'll turn it back to you.
All right. Well, I appreciate the time, and thank you for the good slides and the great information on on explaining a lot of that things. We have a couple questions that have come in with regards to what you're doing, Buzz, with optimization. What are you doing in terms of your diet parameters? A lot of times what we do when we're looking at different diet parameters, we end up going back to like a standard commodity evaluator where they just look at crude protein or energy. What diet parameters do you think would be your top 3 or 4 in this situation?
So let me start by saying I don't look at crude protein, starch, and sugar very strongly. I look at metabolizable protein, and I look at fermentable starch and fermentable total carbohydrate. I believe that those numbers, I am familiar with both AMTS and NDS, and those numbers are available in both of those two platforms. I helped put the original Dalix program together. When I was at Cornell, Danny had asked me to work with Carl, but that program has changed. They do have the model implemented, but I'm not familiar with the revised. I haven't used that in 10 years or so. So for me, I am looking largely at some fiber numbers, and in the platform that I use, I can constrain on UNDF 240 or UNDF 30, which are important to me. And I can constrain on total fermentable carbohydrate, total fermentable starch, and MP. And those are the 5. I mean, there's other things that I put on there. But I also, the platform I use allows me to lock in minerals, for instance. I don't try to do my minerals, optimize them at the same time I'm trying to optimize the organic nutrients. So I can lock those in, put the diet together the way it is, and then lock everything else into its fixed amount. It takes some time because you got to realize you got to allow some room for these things to move. So if you optimize, but you don't give it enough room, it won't go anywhere. And it will give you non-feasibles if you don't give it enough. And sometimes we have constraints that aren't solvable. But basically, that's my strategy. I do think, so I do a lot of training, and one of the things that I have for the last, for almost, when did this come up? Maybe around 2010, 2012, I began to really look at these fermentable fractions. And I think that that's something in the training that I do, I really emphasize that that's what we need to be paying a lot of attention to, fermentable fractions and the NDF. So you probably need to understand something about them and then move from that to using that as your basis for optimizing.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. Another question coming in. Would you say that unless your client is already a very good feed and feed bunk manager, that feeding whole milk back to cows is going to be a difficult task to execute well?
I think that feeding management is important, and yes, it will be important. I don't have a checklist of just how good somebody's got to be. Obviously, I think they've got to have clean bunks. One of the things that Chris talks about a lot is biofilms. So I've fed a lot of whey. In the herds in Idaho, whey is much more plentiful out there because there's a lot of cows, for one thing, and most of that milk goes to other than fluid milk. And so there's a lot of whey. The addition of the fat, or adding the fat in it to whole milk as opposed to whey, is likely to increase the amount of biofilm. So when Chris goes out and does troubleshooting on a calf facility, she's all over looking for the spots where the biofilms are. I hate it when she does that, because then she comes home and she checks me to see if I've had a shower and if I have any biofilm on me. But The biofilm basically is like a protective layer where the bacteria get under and can grow. And that is a bit of a concern. But I think if you clean your bunks every day, Mike Hutchins has suggested, and I don't know where the 50 degrees comes from, but if it's over 50 degrees, you definitely got to be feeding at least 3 times a day to do that. I don't know that. That's not been my experience with whey, but milk is not whey. And I don't have a perfect answer for you on that one, Daniel. I don't think you have to be a perfect manager to make it work. I think if you're really sloppy and you don't clean your bunks all the time, and probably in the heat of the summer, if you don't feed at least twice a day, maybe you should have second thoughts about doing it that way.
And I think the fly situation is also relevant here. Is if you don't have clean bunks, the fly levels are likely to be enormous, which is then going to have a direct impact on cows and intakes and feed quality.
And I'm going to add to something that Chris has told me over and over again. The fly situation, you can't feed Clarifly and get rid of all the flies on the farm, right? We have been in situations where there is so much organic matter, read that as manure and rotting feed and stuff around the facility, that flies have plenty of homes besides the milk. Now, if they're living all around the barn because of a lot of organic matter there, then they're just as happy to go, I assume, land in the milk and go feed and grow there too. So I think that the cleanliness of the facility is going to contribute to whether this whether this is a problem or not.
You know, Buzz, back, we're going to wrap this up in a minute, but back in when I was doing nutrition in Ohio, I was by the Smucker's jelly plant.
Yeah.
And we used to get Smucker's jelly waste, and oh man, it was really nice feed in the winter, but when it hit summer, oh, was that a fly-laden, ugly, black skid loader looking mess. It was,
Yeah.
But
I understand. Of course, you didn't have Clarifly then either.
No, for sure. Sure. But well, that will wrap it up for today. I guess I want to also thank Buzz and Chris for stopping on today and giving some good thoughts. And this will be recorded, so we'll be able to send this out. And there'll be another one coming up probably next week. We're figuring out the talk right now. So if you have any other questions, you can reach out to Buzz or myself. And again, thank you for coming on. We had about 50 people or so again at Max today. So thank you for stopping in and appreciate the time. Take care.
Thanks for the invitation, John.
It was a good discussion.